Continuing where I left off. Chapter 19. After returning to the regiment and reporting to the commander the state of Denisov's affairs, Rostov rode to Tilsit with the letter to the Tsar. On the 13th of June, the French and Russian emperors met at Tilsit. Boris Drobtskoy had asked the important personage on whom he was in attendance to include him in the suite appointed for duty in Tilsit. "I should like to see the great man," he said in French, alluding to Napoleon, whom he had hitherto referred to, like everyone else, as Bonaparte. "You are speaking of Bonaparte?" asked the general, smiling. Boris looked at his general inquiringly and immediately saw that he was being quizzed. "I am speaking, my prince, of the Emperor Napoleon," he replied. The general patted him on the shoulder and smiled. "You will go far," he said, and took him to Tilsit with him. Boris was among the few present at the Niemen on the day the two emperors met. He saw the rafts with royal monograms, saw Napoleon's progress past the French guards on the opposite bank of the river, saw the pensive face of the Emperor Alexander as he sat silent in the inn on the bank of the Niemen, awaiting Napoleon's arrival. He saw the two emperors get into the boat, saw how Napoleon, who reached the raft first, stepped quickly forward to meet Alexander and gave him his hand, and how they retired into the pavilion. Ever since he had begun to move in the highest circles, Boris had made a practice of carefully observing all that went on around him, and noting it down. At the time of the meeting at Tilsit, he asked the names of those who had come with Napoleon, asked about the uniforms they wore, and listened attentively to whatever was said by persons of consequence. The very instant the emperors went into the pavilion, he looked at his watch and did not forget to look at it again when Alexander came out. The interview lasted an hour and 53 minutes, which he made a note of that same evening, along with other facts he felt to be of historical importance. As the emperor's suite was a very small one, to be present at Tilsit on the occasion of this interview between the two emperors was a matter of great moment to a man who prized success in the service, and having succeeded in being there, Boris felt that henceforth his position was definitely assured. He had not only become known, but people had grown accustomed to his presence and accepted him. Twice he had executed commissions to the Tsar himself, so that the sovereign knew his face, and those at court, far from snubbing him as at first when they considered him a newcomer, would now have been surprised had he been absent. Boris lodged with another adjutant, the Polish Count Zelinsky, a Pole brought up in Paris, was rich and passionately fond of the French, and almost every day of their stay at Tilsit, French officers of the guard and from the French general staff came to lunch or dine with him and Boris. On the evening of the 24th of June, Count Zelinsky was giving supper for his French acquaintances. The guest included an aide-de-camp of Napoleon's, the guest of honor, one of his pages, a young boy belonging to an old aristocrat French family, and several officers of the guard. That same day, Rostov, profiting by the darkness to avoid being recognized, arrived in Tilsit in civilian dress and went straight to the quarters occupied by Boris and Lisinski. Rostov, in common with the whole army from which he had just come, was far from having experienced the change of feeling towards Napoleon and the French, who had suddenly been transformed from foes into friends, that had taken place at headquarters and in Boris. In the army, Bonaparte and the French were still regarded with mingled feelings of animosity, contempt, and fear. Not long ago, talking with one of Platov's Cossack officers, Rostov had argued that if Napoleon were taken prisoner, he would be treated not as a sovereign, but as a criminal. And only recently, encountering a wounded French colonel on the road, Rostov had hotly contended that there could be no peace between a legitimate sovereign and the criminal Bonaparte. Consequently, Rostov was astounded to see French officers in Boris's quarters, and in uniforms he had been accustomed to regard with very different eyes from the battle line. The moment he saw the French officer who thrust his head out the door, that belligerent feeling, a hostility he always experienced at the sight of the enemy, seized him. He stopped on the threshold and asked in Russian whether Drobtskoy lived there. Boris, hearing an unfamiliar voice in the entry, came out to meet him. A momentary look of annoyance crossed his face when he recognized Rostov. "Ah, it's you! Glad to see you, glad to see you, he said, however, coming forward with a smile. But Rostov had noticed his first reaction. I've come at a bad time, it seems. I shouldn't have come. But for a matter of business, he said coldly. No, I was only surprised that you had managed to get away from your regiment. I'll be with you in a moment, he said in French to someone who had called them. I see that I've come at a bad time, Rostov repeated. The look of annoyance had quickly vanished from Boris's face. Apparently, having reflected and made up his mind how to act, he took Rostov by both hands and with complete composure led him into the next room. His eyes, gazing steadily and serenely at Rostov, appeared to be veiled, screened as it were by the blue spectacles of social life. So it seemed to Rostov. Oh, please, as if you could come at a wrong time, said Boris, and led him into the room where supper was laid and introduced him to his guest, explaining that he was not a civilian but an officer of the Hussars and an old friend. Count Zelensky, le Comte NN, le Captain SS, he said, naming his guest. Rostov glanced at the Frenchman with a frown, bowed stiffly, and said nothing. Zelensky was evidently far from pleased to receive this unknown Russian into his circle, and did not speak to Rostov. Boris seemed oblivious to the constraint produced by the newcomer, and with the same amiable composure and the same veiled look into his eyes with which he had welcomed Rostov, tried to enliven the conversation. One of the Frenchmen, with typical Gallic courtesy, addressed the obstinately taciturn Rostov, remarking that the latter had probably come to Tilsit to see the Emperor. No, I came on business, replied Rostov shortly. Rostov had been out of humor from the moment he detected the look of displeasure on Boris's face, and as always happens to those who are in an ill humor, it seemed to him that everyone looked at him with hostility and regarded him as an intruder. And in fact he was out of place, and was the only one left out of the conversation, which again had become general. And why does he go on sitting there? The glances turned on him seemed to say. He got up and went to Boris. I'm in the way here, he said in a low voice. Come, let me tell you what I'm here for, and then I'll be off. Oh no, not at all, said Boris. But if you are tired, come into my room, and you can lie down and rest. Well, the fact is, they went into the little room where Boris slept, Rostov without sitting down, and speaking in a tone of exasperation, as if Boris were in some way to blame in the matter, Insta began to tell him about Denisov's affair, asking him whether through his general he could and would intercede with the Tsar on Denisov's behalf, and get the petition for pardon to him. When they were alone together, Rostov, for the first time, was distinctly conscious that he could not look Boris in the face without feeling uncomfortable. Boris, with one leg crossed over the other, and stroking the slender fingers of his right hand with his left, listened to Rostov as a general listens to the report of a subordinate, now looking away, now looking into Rostov's eyes with the same veiled look. Each time this happened, Rostov felt awkward and lowered his eyes. I've heard of affairs of this sort, and I know that His Majesty is very severe in such cases. I think it would be best not to bring it up to the Emperor's attention, but to apply directly to the corps commander. But generally speaking, I believe. So you don't want to do anything? Then say so, Rostov almost shouted, not looking at Boris. Boris smiled. On the contrary, I will do what I can, only I thought at the moment Zelensky's voice was heard calling Boris. Well, go along, said Rostov, and refusing supper, he remained alone in the little room, pacing up and down for a long time, and listening to the hum of light-hearted chatter in the next room. Chapter 20. The day on which Rostov arrived in Tilsit could not have been less favorable for interceding on Denisov's behalf. It was out of the question for him to go himself to the general in attendance, for he was not in uniform and had come to Tilsit without the permission of his commanding officer. And Boris, even he had been willing, could not have done so the following day. On that day, the 27th of June, the preliminary peace terms were signed. The Emperor exchanged decorations. Alexander received the Legion of Honor, and Napoleon the Order of St. Andre, first degree, and on that day a dinner was to be given by a battalion of French Guards for the Priopanesky battalion. The emperors were to be present at the banquet. Rostov felt so ill at ease and found it so disagreeable to be with Boris that when the latter looked in after supper he pretended to be asleep and left early in the morning to avoid seeing him again. He strolled about the town in his frock coat and round hat, staring at the French in their uniforms and looking at the streets and the houses where the French and Russian emperors were staying. In the square he saw tables set out and preparations being made for the banquet, and in the streets the French and Russian colors draped from one side to the other with huge monograms of the initials A and N. In the windows of the houses, too, there were flags and monograms. Boris doesn't want to help me, and I don't care to appeal to him. That's settled, thought Nikolai. Everything's over between us, and I won't leave here without having done all I can for Denisov. And certainly not without getting the letter to the Tsar. The Tsar! But here he is, thought Rostov, who had unconsciously wandered back into the house occupied by Alexandra. Saddle horses were standing at the entrance, and the suites were assembling, evidently in preparation for the Tsar's appearance. Any minute I may see him, thought Rostov. If only I could hand him the letter myself and tell him all. Could they actually arrest me for the civilian dress? Surely not. He would understand on whose side justice lies. He understands everything. Who could be more just, more magnanimous than he? And even if they did arrest me for being here, what would it matter, he thought, looking at an officer who was entering the house occupied by the Tsar. After all, people do go in. Oh, it's all nonsense. I'll go in and hand the letter to the Tsar myself. So much the worse for Brestkoy, who has driven me to it. And suddenly, with a determination he would never have expected of himself, he felt the letter in his pocket and went straight to the house where the Tsar was staying. No, this time I won't miss my opportunity, as I did at Austerlitz, he thought, expecting every moment to meet his sovereign, and feeling the blood rush to his heart at the thought. I will fall at his feet and beseech him. He will lift me up, hear me out, and even thank me. I am happy when I can do good, but to redress an injustice to the greatest happiness, he fancied the Tsar as saying, and passing people who looked after him with curiosity, he entered the porch of the Tsar's house. A broad staircase led straight up from an entry, and on the right he saw a closed door. Below, under the stairs, was a door leading to the rooms on the lower floor. Whom do you wish to see? Someone inquired. I have a letter, a petition, to submit to His Majesty, said Nikolai with a tremor in his voice. A petition? A petition? This way, please, to the officer on duty, he pointed to the door below. Only it won't be accepted. On hearing this indifferent voice, Rostov was suddenly dismayed at what he was doing. The thought of finding himself face to face with his sovereign at any minute was enthralling, and consequently so terrifying that he was on the verge of running away, but the chamberlain who met him opened the door to the officer's room, and Rostov went in. A short, stout man of about 30, in white breeches, high boots, and a batiste shirt that he had evidently just put on, was standing in the room while his valet buttoned onto the back of his breeches a new pair of elegant silk-embroidered braces that for some reason attracted Rostov's notice. The stout man was speaking to someone in the adjoining room. A good figure and her first bloom, he was saying in French, but seeing Rostov he broke off and frowned. What do you want? Is it a petition? What is it? Asked the person in the next room. Another petitioner, answered the man in the braces. Tell him to come later. He'll be coming out directly. We must go. Another time, tomorrow. It's too late. Rostov turned to go, but the man in the braces stopped him. Whom have you come from? Who are you? I come from Major Denisov, answered Rostov. Who are you? An officer? Lieutenant Count Rostov. What effrontery! Send it through the proper channels, and go away, be off. And he began putting on the uniform the valet handed to him. Rostov went back into the hall, where he saw that there was now many officers and generals in full dress uniform who he had to pass. Cursing his temerity, his heart sinking at the thought that he might at any moment come face to face with the Tsar and be disgraced and put under arrest in his presence, and, by now fully aware of the impropriety of his action and repenting of it, Rostov, in downcast eyes, was making his way out of the house through the dazzling suite, when a familiar voice called to him and detained him. What are you doing here, sir, in a frock coat? Asked a deep voice. It was a cavalry general who had won the Tsar's special favor during the recent campaign, and who had formerly commanded the division in which Rostov was serving. In dismay, Rostov began justifying himself, but seeing the kindly, jocose expression on the general's face, he took him aside and in an agitated voice told him of the whole affair, begging him to intercede for Denisov, whom the general knew. After hearing Rostov to the end, the general gravely shook his head. "Too bad, I'm sorry for that brave fellow," he said. "Give me the letter." Hardly had Rostov finished explaining Denisov's case and handed him the letter when the clatter of footsteps and the jingling of spurs was heard on the stairs, and the general left him and went out to the porch. The gentleman of the Tsar's suite ran down the steps and went to the mounts. Hain, the same groom had been to Austerlitz, led up to Tsar's horse, and the faint creak of the footstep that Rostov knew at once was heard on the stairs. Forgetting the danger of being recognized, Rostov made his way to the steps together with some inquisitive bystanders, and again after an interval of 2 years, he saw the features he adored. The same face, the same glance, the same walk, the same combination of majesty and mildness. And the feeling of enthusiasm and love for the Tsar again rose in Rostov's heart with all its old force. In the uniform, the Preobrasky regiment, white camas breeches and high boots, and wearing a star that Rostov did not recognize. It was the Legion of Honor. The monarch came out of the steps with his hat under his arm and drawing on a glove. He stopped and looked about with a glance that shed brightness all around him. After speaking a few words to one or two generals, he recognized Rostov's former commander, smiled, and beckoned to him. The suite drew back, and Rostov watched the general talking at some length to the sovereign. The Tsar said a few words to him and took a step toward his horse. Again, the members of the suite and the crowd of spectators, among whom was Rostov, moved closer to the emperor. Stopping beside his horse, his hand on the saddle, the emperor turned to the cavalry general and said in a loud voice, clearly wishing to be heard by all, "I cannot do it, General. I cannot, because the law is mightier than I." And he put his foot in the stirrup. In the public square to which the Tsar rode a battalion, the Preobrasky regiment was drawn up on the right, facing a battalion of French guards in their bearskin caps on the left. As the Tsar rode up to one flank of the battalions, which presented arms, another group of horsemen galloped up to the opposite flank, and at the head of them, Rostov recognized Napoleon. It could be no one else. He came at a gallop wearing a small hat, a blue uniform, open over a white vest, the St. Andre ribbon over his shoulder. He was riding a remarkable grey Arab thoroughbred with a crimson gold embroidered caparison. Riding up to Alexander, he raised his hat, and as he did so, Rostov, with his cavalryman's eye, could not help noticing that Napoleon did not sit his horse well or with assurance. The battalions shouted hooray and viva l'Empereur. Napoleon said not something to Alexander. The emperors dismounted and took each other's hands. Napoleon's face wore a disagreeable artificial smile. Alexander was saying something to him with a gracious expression. Despite the trampling of the French General's horses, which were holding back the crowd, Rostov followed every movement of the two emperors, never taking his eyes off them. He was amazed to see that Alexander treated Bonaparte as an equal, and that the latter was perfectly at ease with the Tsar, as if this proximity to a monarch were natural, everyday occurrence for him. Alexander and Napoleon, with the long train of their suites, approached the right flank of the Preobrasky battalion, coming straight toward the crowd that was standing there. The crowd unexpectedly found itself so close to the emperors that Rostov was in the front row, was afraid he might be recognized. "Sire, I ask your permission to present the Legion of Honor to be the bravest of your soldiers," said a shrill, precise voice in French, articulating every syllable. It was the diminutive Napoleon who spoke, looking straight up into Alexander's eye. Alexander listened attentively to what was said to him, and bending his head, smiled amiably. "To the man who bore himself with the greatest valor in this last war," added Napoleon, accentuating every syllable as with a composure and assurance that roused Rostov's indignation. He surveyed the Russian ranks drawn up before him, all of whom presented arms with their eyes fixed on their own emperor. "Will your majesty allow me to consult the colonel?" said Alexander, and he took a few hasty steps towards Prince Kolovetsky, the commander of the battalion. Bonaparte, meanwhile, in taking the glove of his small white hand, tore it and threw it away. An aide-de-camp behind him rushed forward and picked it up. "To whom shall it be given?" the Emperor Alexander asked Kolovetsky in Russian, speaking in a low voice. "As your majesty commands." The Tsar frowned with displeasure and, glancing back, said, "But we must give him an answer." Kolovetsky scanned the ranks with a determined look. He glanced taking in Rostov as well. "Can it be me?" thought Rostov. Lazarus, the voice of the scholar kind of rang now. Lazarus, the first man in the front rank, stepped briskly forward. Where are you going? Stay there. Several voices whispered to Lazarus, who did not know where he was to go. Lazarus stopped short and cast a scared, silent look at his colonel. His face twitched, as often happens to soldiers called out of the ranks. Napoleon slightly turned his head and held out his plump little hand behind him as if to take something. The members of his suite, instantly surmising what he wanted, bustled about, whispering and passing something from one to another, and a page, the same one Rostov had seen the previous evening at Boris's, sprang forward and respectfully bowing over the outstretched hand without keeping it waited an instant, placed it in order on a red ribbon. Napoleon, without so much as a glance, pressed two fingers together, and the order was between them. He approached Lazarus, who stood steadily staring at his own sovereign with eyes starting out of his head, and glancing back at Alexander to imply that what he was now doing was for the sake of his ally. The small white hand holding the order touched one of Lazarus' buttons. It was as if Napoleon knew that it was enough for his hand to deign to touch the soldier's breast for that man to be forever happy, rewarded, and distinguished from everyone else in the world. Napoleon merely laid the cross on Lazarus' breast and, dropping his hand, turned toward Alexander as though certain that the cross would remain where he had put it. And in fact it did, because ready hands, both Russian and French, promptly seized the cross and fastened it to the uniform. Lazarus glanced darkly at the little man with the white hands who was doing something to him, and still standing rigid and presenting arms, again looked straight into Alexander's eyes as if asking him whether he was to go on standing there or go away or do something else. But receiving no orders, he stood motionless for some time. The emperors remounted and rode away. The men of the Pribovsky battalion broke ranks, and, mingling with the French guards, sat down to the tables prepared for them. Lazarus sat in the place of honor. French and Russian officers embraced him, congratulated him, and shook his hand. Crowds of officers and civilians drew near simply to look at him. The din of French and Russian voices and their laughter filled the square. Two officers with flushed faces, looking happy and jovial, passed by Rostov. "What do you say to the banquet, my boy?" "All that silver plate," said one. "Have you seen Lazarus?" "Yes, I've seen him. Tomorrow, they say, the Proboscisos will give them a dinner. But what luck for Lazarus! A 1,200-franc pension for life." "How's this for a cat, boy?" shouted a Probosky soldier, donning a shaggy French cap. "First rate, suits you down to the ground." "Have you heard the password?" asked another. "The day before yesterday was Napoleon, France, Bonavoy. Yesterday, Alexander Rossi Grandeur. One emperor gives it one day, Napoleon the next. Tomorrow, emperor will present the St. George, the bravest of the French guards. Has to be done. Must return the compliment." Boris and his friend Zelensky had also come to look at the banquet. On his way back to Boris caught sight of Rostov standing by the corner of a house. "Rostov, how are you? We missed each other," he said, and could not refrain from asking what had happened to him, so strangely dejected and troubled by Rostov's face. Nothing," replied Rostov. "Will you stop by?" "Yes, later." Rostov stood at the corner for a long time, watching the festivities from a distance. In his mind, an agonizing process was going on from which he was unable to draw any conclusions. Terrible doubts rose in his soul. He recalled Denisov's resignation. He changed expression, thought of the hospital for all those amputated arms and legs, all the filth and disease. So vividly did he recall this sense of putrefying flesh that he looked around to ascertain where the smell was coming from. Next he thought of the self-satisfied Bonaparte with his white little hand, who was now an emperor, liked and respected by Alexander. For what then were all those severe arms and legs those men killed? And he thought of Lazarus rewarded and Denisov punished and unpardoned. He found himself thinking such strange thoughts that it would frighten him. Hunger and the savory smell of Probosky dinner roused him from these reflections. He had to get something to eat before leaving. He went to a hotel he had noticed that morning. There he found so many people, among them officers who like himself have come in civilian dress, that he had difficulty in getting dinner. Two officers of his own divisions joined him. The conversation naturally turned on the peace concluded after Friedland. They said that if we had only held out a little longer, Napoleon would have been done for. As his troops had neither provisions nor ammunition, Nikolai ate and drank, chiefly the latter, in silence. He finished a couple of bottles of wine by himself. The unresolved conflict in his mind continued to torment him. He feared to give way to his thoughts, yet could not shake them off. Suddenly, on one of the officers saying that it was mortifying to look at the French, Rostov commenced shouting with unwarranted fervor, to the great surprise of his companions. "And how can you judge what would have been best?" he cried, the blush rushing to his face. "How can you judge the Tsar's actions? What right have we to discuss them? We can understand the aims or actions of the Tsar." "But never said a word about the Tsar," said the officer, justifying himself, and unable to find any other explanation for Rostov's outburst than he was drunk. But Rostov did not heed him. "We are not diplomats, we are soldiers, and nothing more," he went on. "If we are ordered to die, then we die. If we are punished, it means we're in the wrong. It's not for us to judge. If His Majesty the Emperor sees fit to recognize Bonaparte as Emperor and to conclude an alliance with him, then it must be right. Once we begin sitting in judgment and arguing about everything, there will be nothing sacred left. That way we'll soon be saying there is no God, nothing," shouted Nikolai, banging on the table with his fist, very little to the point, as it seemed to his companions, but quite consistent with the train of his own thoughts. "Our business is to do our duty, to wield the saber, not to think, and that is all," he concluded. "And to drink," said one of the officers, not wishing to quarrel. "Yes, and to drink," Nikolai quickly concluded. "Hey there, another bottle," he shouted. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you so much for watching the next episode, and give it a thumbs up if you like it, a thumbs down, leave a comment, subscribe, or do nothing, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.